Hi. In this video, I'm going to attempt to say a few words about logic. And specifically, by logic, I mean a sort of an inquiry into the form of, um, of reason, the form of, the form of thinking, the forms of thinking, as opposed to the contents of thought. And I hope that by the end of this lecture, that distinction between the form of thinking and the contents of thought, I hope it's more clear. That being said, it's something that we've encountered before, just under different names, in earlier lectures. And so I hope that as I go through this, these connections will become clear, and if not, already understood, only in different forms. It's what I will say today. It's a direct continuation from many of the ideas that we encountered in the lecture immediately prior to this. I'm thinking of the idea of knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, but more than that, how we relate to knowledge that we have already acquired. So to say that I know something, to say that I know the day of the week today, that it's Friday. What I mean by that is that I can somehow remember. I can think upon knowledge that I already have. I can remember something, but I also, in some sense, can recognize that my memory is true. If I could remember something, but I didn't have any confidence that what I was remembering is true, it would be very difficult to get any kind of foothold, any kind of starting point, right? But those two things together, that we have some sense of both that we establish relationships to facts and propositions that we call knowledge, and that we can maintain those relationships. That is kind of a basis for us to then attempt to now describe those relationships. And so again, by logic, it's a sort of inquiry into the formal structures of meaning. And so by saying one thing, I entail 1,000 other things. And logic is in some way an attempt to lay bare those kinds of entailments, those connections and those implications between statements and propositions. And so, foremost, logic, it's a descriptive discipline. It's not something that we learn to think logically, and then we can describe it. And you can imagine that in some ways, all creatures have an intuitive understanding of logic. They operate implicitly through logic. But one thing that we're attempting to do in critical thinking is to make explicit many aspects of our thinking and our experience that we otherwise just abide by and operate with, but without really thinking about it or without making them explicit. And so it's taking something that's implicit and trying to describe it in explicit terms. And so that's largely the project of logic. By saying it's a descriptive science, in some ways I'm contrasting it to a prescriptive science or a prescriptive discipline. And the difference would be that one of them is describing what people do, and the other is basically recommending what people ought to do. The distinction is a little bit factitious, because it's obvious that if the discipline of logic is proper, like that it actually does a good job describing models of thought, then it's very clear that it would be kind of strange to recognize and to acknowledge that logic was an accurate science, an accurate description of thought, but then to flout or contradict all of those relations that logic has attempted to lay bare. So in some ways, it's also a recommendation. It's also a prescription if we want to be able to think clearly and articulately. in logic, it's basically establishing relationships between again, statements or propositions, and it's really attempting to describe structures of meaning that we're able to, that we're basically living in and participating all the time. It's in fact another, logic appears, we've already treated logic in some sense in terms of our discussions between and attempting to establish the relationship between evidence and theory. In purely evidence and theory, they almost always contain contents of thought. So there's almost always specific evidence, and it's related to a specific theory. We don't often talk about theory and evidence in the abstract. We were starting to do that in earlier lectures, and in this lecture we'll just take that same process, but only one step further. And so for that reason, we can, rather than think of evidence and theory, we can think of the logical terms. The proper logical terms are premises and conclusion. And so logic is sort of an attempt to reveal the relationships, the structures of meaning that hold between basically statements, propositions, premises, and what can be concluded from those premises. In some ways, it's thinking of it that way, moving from premises to conclusion. It encounters a very similar difficulty to moving from evidence to theory, and that's something I mentioned in an earlier lecture, namely that in some ways it's only by way of the theory, by means of the theory, that we're able to discriminate and discern what evidence is pertinent. We're able to discern out of all of our available information or data or observation, we're able to select which evidence, which of that data specifically can function as evidence for our theory. So the theory it's actually both the end and in some ways the beginning as well. This is very much the same in logic, the conclusion. In other words, often we have to know what our conclusion is going to be before we can marshal the appropriate premises in order to support that same conclusion. So there's a sort of inevitable circularity to the process, and we can, again, just in the spirit of logic being a descriptive science, so an attempt to describe the way we actually think well. It's unavoidable, and it's necessary to acknowledge that kind of double function of the conclusion or of the theory. I just want to return to one point about the image that I gave of basically having all the different, a plethora of observations, just a vast amount, and basically unmanageable amount of data or information or observation, and the necessity of selecting out of that immense basically heap of data, being able to select the elements of that data that are pertinent or that are able to serve as evidence for a theory, that are relevant to the question at hand. Being able to select out of that heap of data the specific elements that are relevant to the theory or the conclusion that one is attempting to prove. That image, it's very expressive because the word logic, this may be familiar to many people. The source of the word logic is the Greek word logos, and logos it appears in many other English words as well. Words like analogy, or epilogue, or it even appears in the word intelligence. It appears not as log but leg. The word legere is it's a Latin metamorphosis of the Greek word logos, and specifically the word logos. It has too many. The word in Greek doesn't have an English equivalent. It's very famous actually for in a different context. It appears at the beginning of the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John in the John 1:1, and in Greek the phrase is en arche en logos. This often in English it's translated as "in the beginning was the Word," and so logos there is translated as word, and it's not as though that translation is incorrect, but it can be misleading because of what we understand by word today, and it might be that we understand too little by the word today. As you can see, it's impossible for me to say anything at all without using words, and so in some ways, word might mean a lot more than we usually take it to mean. But if we just stay with a sort of naive sense or naive kind of intuitive understanding of what word means, then it's very clear that it doesn't capture the concept of logos, and the concept of logos has a lot more to do with reason and structure and order and meaning. These are all in some ways within the same. They all sort of fall under the standard of logos. And specifically, though, logos, that word, that root, log, or in Latin, leg, in fact, the word select. I mentioned different words that derive from the Greek word logos, and I mentioned analogy and prologue and epilogue. Another one, and then I mentioned intelligence as a kind of it's via Latin, derives from that word. Another word that derives from logos actually is select itself. The let, it's the past tense of the leg in Latin. So leg becomes becomes lect in select. And the reason, and so this brings me back to the connection that I wanted to make between that image of selecting out of vast swaths of data, selecting the relevant and the pertinent aspects of that data. This is it's a very expressive image of the idea of logos, and it's a kind of it's an intelligence that allows us to make distinctions and make meaningful distinctions. Or another way of saying that is, or I guess what I mean more accurately than making meaningful distinctions, I guess I mean both of these things at once. I mean making meaningful distinctions and also making distinctions of meaning. Being able to triage and establish hierarchies of meaning, like what is most important, what is more important, what is least important, etc. And this is a good way to think about logos. And in fact, again, it's something that that basically it's in some ways it's so close to us that we don't see it. In other words, it's that by which we make sense of things. We could think of it as sense making in a fundamental sense. And so just like it's almost impossible to, the eye can, an eye can't see itself just because the eye is that through which we see. Fire can't burn itself. In the same way, it's very difficult for the mind to think itself, or intelligibility or intelligence to recognize itself. But in some ways, that's what critical thinking, one aspect of critical thinking is this attempt at kind of reflection, like turning around and attempting to in some ways, attempting to understand what is looking in the first place. And so again, it's by way of this, logos or intelligence, this ability to make sense of things, that we're able to, describe anything at all. And so bringing this back to the question of logic is in some way almost it's taking one element of out of the concept of logos. This specifically structures of meaning or structures of reasoning, and again kind of abstracting from this this full-bodied concept logos, and it's abstracting one element of it, which again is a sort of formal study of relationships among meaning. Now, perhaps the best way to illustrate what I'm trying to say, I keep saying structures of meaning, and it's probably not at all self-evident what I'm intending by that term. perhaps the best way to communicate it is by way of ostensive definition, and by that I just mean giving examples. So there's a specific structure of meaning between, for instance, wine and grapes. And if we just reflect on it for a moment, the concept of wine entails the concept of grapes. In other words, if you have wine in front of you, it implies that there was also a time when you had grapes there. In other words, the wine is it's a sufficient condition to conclude that there were grapes. If you turn that around, and the fact that you have grapes in front of you, the grapes are a necessary condition for wine. So in other words, moving from wine to grapes, the premise of wine is it's a sufficient condition to conclude the presence of grapes. The presence of grapes, on the contrary, the presence of grapes by itself is a necessary condition for wine, because a person could not produce wine without having the grapes. But the grapes themselves are not a sufficient condition for wine, because there's plenty of other things that could be done with grapes other than wine. And so, as I have a couple more examples, but as I offer these examples, I hope that it can begin to, in some ways, form a picture, and we can imagine, we can think analogically and try to picture these structures of meaning that themselves, they don't have shape or they don't have form exactly, but we can try to imagine them spatially, and this can often assist us in grasping or really understanding these conceptual relations. And we've seen the utility of this in the way we've made use of parables up until now. And in fact, the parables themselves, they can offer some examples of this. For instance, we could just take the two that we've relied on the most up until this point, and those being the blind man and the elephant, and then also Plato's parable of the cave. And I'll try to show how each of them basically encompasses specific structures of meaning, specific logical relations, and also I can use this as a segue to talk about basically the counterpart to logic, which is fallacy, and that's in some ways it's almost like structures of meaning that are fraying at the seams, that they don't hold water, so to speak, vessels of meaning that don't hold water. Going back to the parable of the blind man and the elephant, for instance, it's very clear a similar relationship holds in the way that I talked about wine and grapes. If we think about the elephant and then the various aspects that each of the blind men encountered in the elephant, it's clear that starting from the elephant, in the same way we started from wine, starting from the elephant, you can the elephant by itself, it's a sufficient condition to the presence of the elephant is a sufficient condition for the presence of something that feels like a post, something that feels like a tree, something that feels like a snake, something that feels like a wall, etc. And I'm just describing all of the different aspects, the different vantages that each of the blind men encountered when he touched the elephant. The elephant by itself serves as a kind of cause for all those effects. In that way, the elephant is a sufficient condition for the wall feeling, the tree feeling, the post feeling, the spear feeling, etc. And then to start from the other side, the wall feeling. So for example, the blind men who encountered the elephant's side. This by itself, it's a necessary condition for an elephant, just because you couldn't have an elephant that didn't have the feeling of its own side. But by itself, it's not a sufficient condition. And in some ways, this parable lays bare that problem. And in other words, the fact that you feel a wall, it might be an elephant, but it might be something other than an elephant, like a wall. And each of the blind men basically made this mistake of trying to kind of confusing necessary and sufficient conditions is one way to look at it. Another way of looking at it is confusing cause and effect. The wall by the feeling of a wall by itself, it might be an elephant, but it might be 1,000 other things. In the same way that grapes by themselves, they might be used to produce wine, but again, you could use them for 1,000 other things, like grape jelly or grape juice, or you could plant the grapes, or you could feed the grapes to the birds, or whatever you happen to do with the grapes. There are many things you could do with them other than make wine with them. Moving on to show how Plato's parable of the cave contains another one of these structures of meaning. If we think about, again, just to picture it to ourselves, there are figures that are casting shadows. And it's very clear that, so if we think of the figure in relation to the shadow, it's very clear that the figure itself, that's maybe not the best way to put it. If we think of the figure together with the whole setup at the bottom of the cave, so the figure together with the light source, together with the wall, that by itself, so all of those things together, those produce sufficient conditions for the generation of the shadows on the wall. You can think of this too it's almost like a projection screen in a movie theater. So the whole movie theater itself, that's sufficient conditions for the movie the cinema, the movie to play in front of the people. But to turn that around, and going back to the analogy of Plato, or the parable of Plato's cave, starting from the shadows, well, that's not the best way to put it. The shadows themselves, if you start with the shadows, excuse me, I did this in a very misleading way because I turned the thing on its head. If you start with the shadows, you're starting with an effect. And you know that the effect, I really turned this around. You know that the effect, if there's an effect, it entails a cause. So if you start with the shadows themselves are a sufficient condition to entail the presence of figures that are casting those shadows. If you start with the figures themselves, they are certainly necessary conditions to entail the casting of those. They're necessary conditions to entail the casting of those shadows, because you couldn't, only figures cast shadows. But by the same token, they're not sufficient conditions because they require other necessary conditions. And this is where what I said before can make more sense. If you think of all of the whole scene together, so the figures, but also the light source, and also the wall, and also the appropriate distance, and all of those things together, then it's clear how all of those necessary conditions together, they can produce the sufficient conditions for the shadow. And so this, I hope, again, I hope this is becoming clearer, the way in which two things are related to one another in terms of the presence of one will also imply the presence of the other one, or in other cases, sometimes it won't. Sometimes it will suggest the presence of the other one, etc. And so logic is an attempt to describe these connections like that. We see the way in which, again, Plato's parable of the cave illustrates an example of sound reasoning but turned on its head, like gone astray. And an example is when exactly what Plato describes, the people in the bottom of the cave, they mistake the shadows. They treat the shadows as though the shadows were their own cause, and so they fail to take into account that the shadows are the effect. And so these are different ways. If we then consider both the blind men and the Plato's prisoners, both of these groups, they express ways in which logic can sort of go sour, and the way people are sort of they think they're using logic, but in fact they're running astray. And so by studying logic, though, we are in some way attempting to kind of fortify ourselves, or maybe make it less likely that we will have the wool pulled over our eyes in different ways. And it's not something that we can just learn a few facts and then like all philosophy, it's never merely a question of imparting information. If that were true, then we wouldn't have had to have the discussion about evidence and theory, etc. We wouldn't have to think about intelligence, because intelligence is exactly being able to select and make sense and be able to interpret that information. And so if learning logic were merely a question of receiving the information, then we would only that itself, we wouldn't have to do philosophy at all. And basically, rather than thinking of it as again kind of taking in or gobbling up these different bits of data, we have to think of it much more as a kind of practice, like something we do for the sake of learning to do it and becoming more proficient with it. And so in that way, it's a good sign when something is challenging or when something is difficult to apprehend, because again, it means we're working on the edge of what we're capable of at that point, and we know that working at the edge is where most of our insights and most of our development can come from. So I've given a kind of very general sense of the nature of logic, and now I'll try to speak a little bit more specifically about some of these forms that have been identified, and some of the most basic forms of logic. And one way in sort of talking about logic is to start to classify different venues of logic, so to speak. And there are there are a number of distinctions we can make, and so I'll just try to make some of these distinctions in the hopes that it brings the subject into sharper relief. Basically, there are two forms of reasoning, and there can always, depending on how we interpret, or how we parse things out, how we name things, there can always be more or fewer than this. But there's two of the most common. The most common distinction in logic is to, perhaps the initial one is to distinguish between logic or reason and fallacy, and I've already done that. And so now within logic, I'll distinguish between what could be called, or what is often called, deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And I'll try to characterize each one of them. It's very difficult actually to offer a watertight definition of either one of them, because just like it's very similarly, it's very difficult to offer a watertight definition of anything, because there always seem to be also, for example, it's not clear what species means biologically, because if you define it by all of the morphological characteristics, there will always be exceptions to it. Like, for example, I saw the Canada geese haven't migrated yet, and I saw a white goose 3 days ago. It's obvious that if, well, in some ways it's the same as all the other geese, because I don't know, it seemed to be a goose. For many reasons, except that it didn't have at all, it was totally different morphologically. Like, the color couldn't have been a starker contrast with the other colors. It's also another way, perhaps, that we could attempt to define species is by saying, they have to be able to reproduce viable offspring. But again, it's obvious that just because one individual can't produce viable offspring doesn't it'd be strange to think that individual is immediately discounted or cast out of the species. That's a strange way of thinking, and I don't think anyone really thinks that way. And so it's rather a question of kind of getting a sense for what we mean by the word species, and then using, sort of treating the exceptions as though they prove the rule, so to speak. And that's what I'll be doing when I try to describe or characterize deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, one way to think of it is that if the reasoning is if the structure of the argument is valid, in other words, the structure is structure is watertight, to use the metaphor that I've drawn on several times now, and the premises are true. So, in other words, if the premises and lead to the conclusion, then if they necessarily lead to the conclusion, is a good way to say it, then the argument is a deductive argument. It's a valid deductive argument. If it's an invalid deductive argument, it's a sort of fallacy. And so again, that's in our other category, our category outside of logic. If the premises necessarily lead to the conclusion, then the argument is deductive and it's valid. If the premises are also true, then it's called a sound argument. And so soundness pertains to deductive arguments. As an example, we can in some ways the cleanest or the neatest examples are examples that are like from geometry, and it's just because geometry by itself, all of the terms are defined in very strict delineation, and so we can say something like if we have a polygon whose with three sides, so if we have a polygon with three sides whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees, then it's a triangle. And there's a clear logical relationship between those statements, right? So triangle itself, the concept of triangle, it entails those two other statements, so that it's a polygon with three sides and that its interior angles add up to 180 degrees. And so that's a good example of sort of deductive structure. Another example of a deductive structure would be to say, for example, all human beings have a height. All human beings have a height. Edward is a human being. Therefore, Edward has a height. This is a clear deductive argument, and it's sound because I think the premises are relatively uncontroversial. An example of how this could go wrong, so fallacies, deductive fallacies. An example of an argument that would be unsound and also invalid would be to say, Edgar has a height. It's hard not to have written this down, but Edgar has a height was the conclusion of the last argument. Suppose you use the conclusion as a premise, the conclusion that I used for the last argument. Suppose that you said, Edgar has a height, all human beings have a height, therefore Edgar is a human being. That's not a sound, it's not a valid argument. And the reason is, again, it's very difficult to show the reason without being able to write this down. But if you just think about what I said, it's very clear that just because Edgar has a height does not entail that Edgar is a human being. Edgar could be anything else. Edgar could be a camel or a centaur or anything else with a height. And so the mere fact that Edgar has a height and the mere fact that human beings have a height, that doesn't entail that Edgar is a human being. But if again we say Edgar is a human being, all human beings have a height, therefore Edgar has a height, that is a valid structure. Okay, and so that's kind of the nature of deductive arguments. In some ways, a way to think about the deductive argument is that you could settle the situation without having to without having to go check somewhere. Yeah, so we don't have to go and we don't have to go find Edward, to know that Edward has a height. You can tell that I'm lying because I can't remember the name that I used in the first case. Or you can tell that I'm not thinking about somebody that I actually know. We don't have to go and find Edward and discover empirically whether or not he's a centaur or a camel. Merely because again the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So by contrast to deductive arguments, one way to think about inductive arguments is that you have to sort of like import empirical observation to either fortify or falsify your conclusion, and um, in other words, with an inductive argument, it's never a question of certainty in the way that a deductive argument is. It's always a question of strength or weakness. Probability is another way to look at it. And so here's an example that, and it's a sort of metamorphosis of the other example, and it shows. It's an example that the premises aren't exactly. There's something off about the premises, but I'm going to retain them just for the sake of contrasting, trying to contrast apples to apples and not apples to oranges. And so suppose we say all human beings that I know of have a height. Like all human beings that I've seen have a height. Now I'm just going to say right from the top of this that there's a problem with that premise, which is it's kind of when we think about human beings, we generally, again, maybe there could be exceptions to this. If somebody, I don't know, is picturing disembodied spirits and still calling them human beings. But generally by human being, we basically imply, a physical body with a height. And so when I say all the human beings that I've seen have a height, it doesn't really leave open the possibility that I might encounter a human being that doesn't have a height. But just to retain the consistency here, I can say all human beings that I've seen have a height. Edgar is a human being. Therefore, it's likely, it's probable, I have a very strong reason to believe that Edgar will have a height. But I can't know for certain until I encounter Edgar. That's the kind of structure that we would call inductive. Again, it's kind of a strained example, and I had to strain it just for the sake of maintaining consistency with the example that I gave for a deductive argument. There's a very famous philosopher named David Hume who thought actually of the fact that we expect the sun to rise tomorrow. He said, this is famously called the problem of induction, and it's precisely that idea that we can never be certain. And so he said, we really have very little basis to believe or to, I guess it's kind of a strange argument that he makes, but he says the fact that you've observed the sun come up every morning for as many days as you've lived, it doesn't really give you grounds to believe that it will come up tomorrow. And again, his reason is specifically what's called the problem of induction, which is the kind of lack of certainty. Obvious problem with that way of thinking is just to consider what we mean by the concept of morning, and it's not clear that we can even think of the concept of morning without entailing the sun coming up. And so who knows what Hume would say to that? I guess the reason that I bring this up is just to show, sort of to emphasize again, a notion that we encountered in the last lecture, which is that there is a sort of, and this was under the rubric of the term syngenius. It was Plato's term from the Meno. The idea that there's a sort of a common structure of meaning that everything participates in, and if we can grasp it at one point, we've sort of we have the world by its coattail, so to speak. And this again, it's something that I spoke more thoroughly about in the last lecture. But the example of talking about the morning, we realize that concept by itself, if we really can really take hold of that concept, we've also taken hold of many other things, including the sun, for instance. Now, another example of an inductive argument, but it's again a little bit problematic, is to say that and this is a famous one. It was used by a philosopher of science called Carl Hempel, and he said he used it. It's kind of called Hempel's paradox, and the idea is like if the argument or the example that he used is all ravens in Iceland are black, and this is the question is this an inductive argument or a deductive? And so and therefore, if I find a specific raven in Iceland, I know it will be black. Do I know that before I have to go or I mean, can I ever know that, right? Without, in some ways, omnisciently knowing about every single raven. It's a strange question because we might think like if I did find a white raven or any other color raven, like I don't know, like a bright orange raven. If I really did find a raven like that, would I don't know, would I call it a raven, or would I think of it as kind of like a separate genus almost? And so the reason that I bring up these problems, and they're not exactly problems, they're more exceptions, but it's to show the way in which we're really dealing with structures of meaning, and we use language as kind of almost like labels that they don't the labels aren't labels for things, they're labels for meaning. They're labels for meanings, and so that's why we always have to inquire into what exactly is the structure of meaning that we're labeling with a given word. And the problems that I brought up are they generally stem from that potential discrepancy. And I think again the only way to resolve that discrepancy is to come to understanding of, define our terms before we begin in any kind of discussion. But that's discussions themselves, where we are. I mean, a reason to study and to have respect for logic is partly for the sake of being able to have intelligible discussions, and it's almost impossible to have discussions if the parties don't agree to maintain consistency and maintain fidelity to structures of logic. There's a one principle of logic, and it's kind of like an axiom of logic, that if you don't agree with this, or if you don't assume this, if you don't believe this to be true, then it's very difficult to proceed in any meaningful way. And that's it's called the law of non-contradiction. And the idea is like something can't both be the case and also not be the case at the same time and in the same way. And there's a very famous statement, or I don't know how famous it is, but it's very memorable. Once you hear it, it's hard to forget it. And it's I can't remember the philosopher's name. I'll put it in the notes to this video. But he was an Islamic philosopher from sometime during the European Middle Ages, and he made this statement that anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction deserves to be beaten and burned until he will acknowledge that it's not the same thing to be beaten and to be burned. And he's basically pointing out the problem with, in some ways, denying the law of non-contradiction. It kind of denies your basis for denial in the first place, because by denying something, you're kind of, that's your ability to differentiate it from everything that it's not, right? And if you take away that foundation, then nothing that you say really retains its meaning. And so I hope that at least through these different examples and this kind of desultory progression through these various sides of logic, I hope that in some way the nature of logic, and that anyone who's been listening has been able to sort of, if we consider to the beginning of this lecture and now to the end, I hope that anyone who's been listening has a sense of kind of familiarity, and a sense of again, like, not as though you could exactly define logic, because it's not clear that would be possible in the first place, but rather that you feel that it's somehow you have an understanding of the discipline itself, and what kind of and then also what the discipline is for, which is to recognize these these implicit structures of meaning that we abide by and operate by, but we don't often articulate and make explicit to ourselves. It's maybe just as a kind of final subject, it's maybe worth just mentioning ways, saying a little bit about fallacy. And fallacy is, again, any kind of any sort of logical flaw or deviation, or maybe like a semblance of logic that's not actually logic. So almost like something mendacious or misleading. So something that pretends to be logical but isn't. And I think foremost the example that I've already kind of alluded to is when words mean different things, or they don't have a clearly defined meaning. And I said that for the sake of being able to speak reasonably and speak logically and have a meaningful discussion, we have to, in some ways, come to agreement about the terms that we're using. Because again, the terms that we're using, they're meant to indicate meanings. The words stand in for concepts, but it's not always clear which concept is standing in for a given word that somebody uses. And this is probably the preeminent source of fallacy. In fact, it's when words are used to mean something other than is understood by them, by another party. And the first example that comes to my mind is it's actually quite a timely example, and it's the term case in respect to cases of corona right now. And this can be the reason that it can be a fallacy, and again, a fallacy is something that misleads somebody. And so if the term is perfectly understood and clearly understood, and the communication is perfect, then this won't be a fallacy. But the term case has the risk of being equivocal, and the reason for that is because up until we've had the technology to perform so many tests, and I believe there in the United States alone, we're performing over 1 million tests per day, and the definition of case that we're operating by is it's basically a positive test. And the reason that this has the potential to be misleading and therefore to be a fallacy, which is to say sort of misleading speech or false speech, it's that case. Often people understand by case, they understand. So if you have a case of the flu, for instance, we generally assume case to mean that you have specific symptoms and you had to go and seek medical assistance for those symptoms. So a case of an illness generally means symptoms of the illness. But one of the confusing and potentially misleading things about corona is that we've been able to identify. We've been able to basically make a distinction that to my knowledge, hasn't really been made to this degree in the past, and the distinction between actual symptoms and testing positive. And so case, many people have in mind case as somebody with symptoms, but we know that there can be asymptomatic cases. And so this to me is an example of a word that in some way it's an example of where a fallacy can begin if somebody doesn't have a clear idea of what case means in a given context, because in some contexts it still means having symptoms. In other contexts it doesn't, and in popular contexts now it doesn't, but it's not clear that everyone really grasps that. Another there are many different ways to think about fallacies, but that's in some ways that was the first thought that came to my mind in respect to a fallacy of what could be called ambiguity, so like lack of clarity in definitions. There are many other fallacies, and in fact there are just as many fallacies as Um, I should say that, yeah, so to speak of, we could make a similar distinction um, that we made in the same way we kind of bifurcated logic into induction and deduction. We can bifurcate fallacies into fallacies of form and fallacies of, well, informal fallacies. These also could be called fallacies of content. So you have formal fallacies on one side and informal fallacies on the other side. Formal fallacies we've in some ways already treated, and that was talking about deduction. Those are arguments in which the premises don't share a strong connection to what they're intended to conclude. If we think about informal fallacies, the example that I gave of case is an informal fallacy, where it means some things to some people and some things to somebody else, and so merely using the word that itself leaves the question somewhat ambiguous. There's many other ways. There's many other kinds of informal fallacies, and these are again fallacies in which you might not be able to tell they're fallacies unless you have some familiarity with the content, with the subject matter. Examples of informal fallacies are, for instance, ad hominem attacks, and we see this all the time with political races, like when two politicians are running, and the one of them is harping on the other one's I don't know, mansion in California, and the first one is harping on the other one's connection. The other one's kind of like connection to lobbyists and under the table money from big corporations, etc. And these are examples of in some ways, these are often thought of as ad hominem attacks, where you're attacking the person and not this person's argument. That being said, in the case of political candidates, it's maybe, as much as I hate to say this, it's maybe less of a fallacy than it might seem, because in some ways we are electing representatives, and we're not merely voting on issues directly, because in some ways we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, and that means that we vote for representatives who, in turn, decide specific issues for us. And so, in some ways, insofar as any of those ad hominem attacks are illuminating of somebody's character, insofar as they are, then maybe it's not as much of a fallacy as it might seem to use ad hominem attacks in political campaigns. As much as I regret to acknowledge that fact, there are as many other fallacies as you can. As a person is willing to distinguish. We again, in our kind of lingua franca through these lectures, we can already talk about the blind man and the elephant fallacy, or the Plato's cave fallacy, and I've kind of tried to describe each of those a little bit. Again, just to recapitulate, the blind man and the elephant fallacy would be in some ways mistaking a part for a whole is one way to put it. The Plato's cave fallacy would be in some way mistaking an image for its source, for instance, mistaking a shadow of something for the being that's causing the shadow, etc. And so fallacies, a person can become quite creative, actually, and in attempting to describe and depict various ways in which logic goes awry. And so on the one sense you have sound logic and healthy logic, and on the other sense you have fallacies. And I think it's precisely it's logic itself that enables us to attempt to distinguish between those two things. And so again, this is a reason not to deny the law of non-contradiction. That's probably a good place to stop. And again, I hope that something that I've said, or maybe a number of things that I've said, can serve to again just cast light on this subject. And I hope that it also casts light on this subject that is not just immediately available or immediately apparent from just reading a basic textbook about logic. And so that's probably a good place to end this lecture, but I won't end before I wish everyone the very best, and until next time.